In this video, I'm going to introduce you to ElectroServer 5 extensions. I'll talk a little bit about what they are, the types of components used to make up extensions, we'll look at the directory structure of extensions, and I'll show you some examples. We won't be looking at any source code in this video, and I won't be showing you how to install extensions. We'll cover those topics in future videos. When writing a multi-user application, such as a multiplayer game, you almost always are going to need some amount of custom server code to handle game logic, talking to database, things like that. That's where extensions come in. Extensions give you the ability to extend the functionality of the server. You write custom code in Java or ActionScript 1, and then this compiled code is packaged into an extension and installed in the server. When the server starts up, it knows how to use your extensions. Example extensions would be, say, the server-side game logic for a poker game, or some server-side logic to handle validating user login information against a database. There are three types of components that can be used to make up an extension. There's plugins, event handlers, and managed object factories. Let's talk about the plugins first, and then we'll move on to the other. Most multiplayer games happen inside of a room. So, for example, if you had a poker game, you might have 4 or more players get together and join a room. Well, if you were to have those 4 players in a room and you need some server-side logic to handle the game, it makes sense to have some amount of server-side code that could be instanced and scoped to that room. That's where plugins come in. There are 2 types of plugins. Room-level plugins and server-level plugins. They're both written almost exactly the same way, and then they can just be instantiated and scoped either to the server or to a room. So in the room-level plugin example, for say a poker game plugin, it would handle shuffling the deck, making sure it's the right player's turn. It would handle end of game logic, things like that. All players within the game can message the plugin and receive messages from the plugin. An example of a server-level plugin would be something that you might only need to have one instance of. Let's say that you had a plugin that was designed just to save scores to the database. Well, each of your instance game plugins at the room level could talk to the server level plugin to tell it to save scores to the database. So those are plugins. Event handlers. ElectroServer exposes has several hooks for you to add custom code that can be executed based on certain server events. Those events are things like a login event handler, which is executed when a user tries to log in, logout event handler, executed when a user tries to log out, private message event handler, public message event handler, and so on. These can be really useful, and almost every application is going to have at least a login event handler. That would allow you to validate a user's login information against the database. Then there's managed object factories. A managed object factory is a special case object that can be used to create objects that need to be tracked over time. Any piece of code in an extension can call a managed object factory and request or return an object to it. An excellent use for a managed object factory is accessing a database connection pool. And there is an example in our code in the code examples folder that shows this. It's called connection pool. So now let's look at the directory structure of extensions. There's a root folder here called extensions, and let me show you what this refers to. I am in the installation directory of ElectroServer. I've got ElectroServer 5.0.1 installed. And if I double click on the server directory, there's an extensions directory in here. If I go in there, you can see that I have 2 extensions installed already. All extensions that get installed will end up in this extensions folder. So that's what this folder is here. This extensions folder and this diagram refers to the server/extensions folder in the installation directory of ElectroServer. So let's look at this part of the diagram, which shows all the types of files and folders that could exist inside of an extension. Every extension needs an extension.xml file. The extension.xml file is how ElectroServer knows which components you have installed in your extension and what the name of your extension is. We'll look at the contents of an extension.xml file in a minute, but for now just know that it's where you define all the different components that happen to be in this directory structure here. So if you wrote your extension using Java, the compiled jar file or jar files would end up here in this lib directory. If you happen to compile Java class files instead of a jar, you would put them in this classes directory. Usually they're jar files, and you just throw them here in the lib directory. If your code was written using ActionScript, you would throw it in this scripts folder here. And then if you had any files that your extension would need to load when it's initialized, you would throw those here in a config folder. So some extensions might need some configuration file, XML file or something, or maybe a data file that defines the properties of a game, stuff like that. You would just throw those here in a config folder, and then your extension can load those files straight from this folder. So now let's look at an example extension. So I'm back over here in ElectroServer. I'm in the server extensions folder, and like I showed you a little while ago, I have a couple of extensions already installed. One of them is the UDP example extension. This is an example that's provided in the code examples folder, and I just happen to install it here. So I'm going to double click to go inside of it. And you can see that there's an extension.xml file and there's a lib folder. There's no scripts folder because this isn't an ActionScript component. And there's no config folder because there's nothing I need to load. So all we have is the lib folder and the extension XML file. Inside of the lib folder you see that there's a jar, and this is the compiled component. So I'm going to open up this XML file. This is the extension XML that defines the UDP example. Everything in the extension XML file needs to be wrapped in the extension node. Then the extension has to have a name. Has to have a unique name, and we just add that here in the name node. And then, as I mentioned a little while ago, there are 3 types of components that can be included in an extension. There's plugins, event handlers, and managed object factories. So all of the plugins that are in this extension need to be under a plugins node. You notice that there is a plugins node here, but there's no event handler node, and there's no managed object factory node. That means that we don't have any login, we don't have any event handler components or managed object factory components as part of this extension. In fact, we just have, let me add a little white space here. We just have this singular plugin installed. So that plugin is called, has to have a name. We put that under the handle node here, and we call it UDP example. and it's written using Java, and then we have to give a path to the class that needs to be initialized, and that's written out right here. So that's the makeup of an example, really simple extension XML file. Let's look at one that's a little bit more complicated. So I showed you that I also have a tank game extension installed. If I go inside of here, you can see that there's still just one XML file, and there are a couple of jars in here. One of them is used to give logging abilities to the game, and then the other one is the actual game jar. So let's open the extension XML file for this extension. I'm going to add a little white space here. Just so that we can easily make out which components are installed. So there are 3 components installed in this plugin. I'm sorry, in this extension. There is one event handler, and there are 2 plugins. So 3 components altogether. The extension lifecycle event handler is an event handler that is executed whenever the extension is initialized or told to shut down. And so generally that just means whenever the server starts up and shuts down. And there's a handle for this component. It's written in Java, and here's the path to the class to initialize. I won't explain what this class is used for, just because we're looking at extensions and we're not really looking at the game as an example. Then down here there are 2 plugins installed. One of them is the timestamp plugin, and the other one is the tank game plugin. Now we don't have to. I mentioned earlier that there's room level plugins and server level plugins. Well, when it comes to defining them here, a plugin is a plugin. It only becomes a room level plugin when you initialize it and at runtime. It's not defined as a room level or server level plugin. But the timestamp plugin is one that we do initialize as a server level plugin. It's something that clients use just to ask the server what time it is. And the tank game is a room level plugin that's initialized every time we need to have an instance of the game running. So that's it really for a general overview of what extensions are. Look for future videos about how to code extensions, or the components that make up extensions, and how to install them.